Hello and welcome to week 16, everyone. You have made it. We're going to have a presentation this week on the final third of the Plague of Doves, and then the only thing left after that will be the final exam, which will be open for the duration of finals week. The details on that are under the finals week module on the course website, but certainly don't forget to take the final exam. And if you have questions about it before you take it, you can contact me. Just be aware that once you start it, you have to finish it. But this presentation is over the final third of the Plague of Doves, so let's get to that. Starting with the chapter titled Shomengwa. At this point, this is the final presentation of the class. I'm not going to spend much time on plot summary. You have certainly learned to read for plot as well as theme and character and setting and all of these things by this point. So I just want to hit some notable points in the text that might be useful to you, both as you just learn to think about literature and also perhaps as you take the final exam. So this chapter is told by Judge Coutts, describing Corwin Peace, who you remember is the young boy who made fun of the nun early in the book and called her Godzilla, and Evelina sort of went after him for that. He's an adult now, and he's basically sort of a loser. He is, selling drugs and into trouble, and yet Judge Coutts says this. He says on page 197, he was a bad thing waiting for a worse thing to happen, a mistake, but one that we kept trying to salvage because he was so young. So this is another one of those sort of significant passages that sometimes you can just sort of read right over. First of all, what does this mean? Well, it means that Corwin is trouble and Corwin is in trouble, and yet it says that we want to salvage him because he's so young, the implication being that he has potential. But the other important question here is, who is we? Judge Coutts might want to save him, but Judge Coutts is one person. So if it was just him, he would say, I kept trying to salvage. So there's an implication here that Corwin is somehow either the responsibility or the project or the task or something like that of the community here, the community of Pluto, the community of the reservation. There is certainly an opportunity to read into this sort of Native American traditions and beliefs. They are largely a community-based group in a lot of ways, although certainly that varies from tribe to tribe. And partially because there is no one else to take care of people on a reservation. History tells us that the federal government was more interested in putting Indians on reservations than taking care of them once they got there. And so if the community doesn't take care of Corwin, Corwin will not be taken care of. So there's a lot of interesting stuff suggested in this, especially the second sentence here, that the community will and sees it as a responsibility to take care of Corwin Peace. And while we're talking about Corwin, this is another really interesting passage, talking about Corwin sort of selling drugs. Judge Coutts tells us, quote, drugs now travel the old fur trade routes, and where once Corwin would have sat high on a bale of buffalo robes or beaver skins and sung traveling songs to the screeching wheels of an ox cart, now he drove a banged-up Chevy Nova with hubcaps missing and back end dragging. This is a really interesting comparison, not just because it sort of does a nice job of crystallizing the characterization of Corwin and sort of laying some interesting thematic elements on top of his sort of not very interesting drug dealing, but it's very interesting specifically as it relates to our ideas of the rural. So at one point, if you think of Weinsberg or Ethan Frome, people would get on their wagons and they would transport, crops, or in this case, furs. Today, in some ways, the rural is very different. We've talked in the threads, for example, a lot about how the rural has changed, and between books, how it has changed. And yet, while the mode of transportation and what is being transported has changed, Corwin Peace is doing what people have done in rural places for a long time. They've loaded up something that there is a supply of and transported it where it needed to go. If you want to take the sort of illicit drug dealing aspect of it out, you could think of, for example, truck drivers today. Many rural people drive trucks for a living, and they're doing sort of what has always been done. They've packed up the things that are produced maybe out in more rural areas and moved them toward the urban centers. Um, so, yes, rural places have changed, but what happens in rural places, more generally speaking, thematically, maybe haven't. Maybe it's a case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. And also in this chapter, we get the story of Shemingwa, who we have seen repeatedly in the book already as sort of an old man. But we get the story of his upbringing and who he was as a young boy and how he learned to play the fiddle, and also how his arm was injured. I don't want to go into all the details of that, but it's worth asking yourself, how is the tragedy of Shemingwa's upbringing related to our discussions specifically of rural isolation? In other words, how do the things that happened to Shemingwa happen because of where he lived, because of where he was raised? So, for example, when he is kicked by the cow and his arm bone is shattered, that could certainly happen in an urban place. But in an urban place, you have more immediate access to health care. In Shemingwa's location and upbringing, that access, both financially and geographically, was not really available. So Shemingwa's arm was injured permanently for his whole life because he was kicked by a cow. But more generally, that injury also results from a rural upbringing at a certain point in time. And this is something that I really encourage you to keep thinking about, even as you leave this class and consider thinking about the rural, or the urban for that matter, but how setting in literature or geography in real life affects the lives that we live. We don't always think about it, but it does. The other thing I want to mention in this chapter is Shemingwa has this dream that leads to him finding the fiddle that Henri and Lafayette, if you remember from the flashback chapter where they went out to find the land that Pluto was eventually built on, he finds this fiddle 20 years after Henri puts it afloat on a canoe. And you might have said to yourself, well, that doesn't really seem very believable. Because this is a very realistic novel for the most part. It's not that people don't have a belief system. It's not that, ideas about religion and the supernatural and all of these things don't enter in. But for the most part, they are presented the same way they're presented in the real world today. Something that people discuss, but not something that you see occurring supernaturally all around you all the time. But we do have this moment where suddenly this either supernatural or very, very, very unlikely situation where this fiddle floats around for 20 years and then shows up to Shemingwa happens. And when I teach this course in person, I always ask the class, what do you make of this? How are you supposed to read this otherwise realistic novel when this unrealistic thing happens? Because I have added Bless Me Ultimate to the reading list for the first time in this class, I think you all are maybe a little more prepared for that, because we saw more of this sort of thing. After you've read about the golden carp, a fiddle showing up in a canoe maybe isn't so hard to make sense of. But the only thing I would encourage you to do is be aware, and the bullet point on here, I label it the danger of Anglocentrism. That's like a sign on the road or something. All I mean by that is, in an Anglocentric society, in white or Western American culture, and European culture, I think there's a certain way that we view the world that's very sort of fact-based, very sort of based on, I guess, provability. It's important to remember that not all cultures view the world only that way. If my wife comes in and says, I just saw a dragon, my suspicion is going to be, no, you didn't, right? Some cultures view the world, though, through other lenses, where stories and sort of unverifiable things are very much a part of daily life. Many Native American cultures are that way. It's very easy to be dismissive of that. In fact, that could be arguably one of the reasons that Americans in the 17 and 1800s were very dismissive of natives, because they didn't understand their culture. It seemed simple or not entirely believable or verifiable. And that is because of what we bring to the table. Now, I'm not saying we need to necessarily believe these things, but it is important when reading literature about other cultures to believe that they believe these things. So, just something to point out within the novel. And we reach the end of Judge Couch's section with this bit of narration from him, the character, himself. He says this just generally about life in Pluto for him. He says, quote, "I do my work. I do my best to make the small decisions well, and I try not to hunger for the great things, for the deeper explanations. For I am sentenced to keep watch over this small patch of earth, to judge its miseries and tell its stories." So, first of all, how are we meant to interpret this? That Judge Couch sees himself as sort of a caretaker of this small town of Pluto. And I would also ask you, to what extent might this be uniquely rural? Certainly, people can feel ownership and sort of a caregiving instinct in lots of places, not just rural. But the idea that a single person can feel that they are somehow responsible for an entire town makes a lot more sense in a rural location where towns can be very small. Very few people are going to feel that they are responsible for all of Chicago or New York City. The mayors, maybe the police chiefs, and the fire chiefs. That would be about it. But in a small town, it is small enough to feel an overall ownership of. And I think that might make this moment sort of uniquely rural. So after Judge Couch, we return once again to Evelina as a narrator or the storyteller. And in the Reptile Garden, Evelina is older. She has gone to college, or she goes to college. So in a very real sense, this is the story of Evelina leaving home, leaving her rural home. Of course, we have seen this story elsewhere. I think sometimes, if nothing else, one of the things you should take away from this class is an understanding of the rural character types. Right? And maybe the most prevalent one is the person who can't wait to leave the rural home. We've seen it in Weinsberg. We have seen it sort of in Ethan Frome. We've seen it in Sula, the character herself, Sula. I think we've seen it in some minor characters in Bless Me Ultima. I suspect maybe we've seen it in all of the books. So the thing I would ask you to think about with Evelina here is, how is her version of this idea, the small town person who is ready to leave, similar and different thematically from the others we've seen? Because while it is a type, it would be a mistake to assume that it's the same character every time. The desire to leave a small town is not monolithic in motivation. Some people want to leave for very different reasons than others. For example, for Evelina, it seems to be getting an education, going to college. Not everybody leaves to go to college. Sula did. Ethan Frome did. Other characters did not. Antonio's brothers in Bless Me Ultima did not. Right? And it's always worth asking, here with Evelina, but I think with any of the characters we're talking about, does leaving help her find herself, lose herself, or both? Now, Evelina's story is very specific to her, but that's something to consider. The other thing that's interesting in this chapter is she also eventually returns home. After what I would say some fairly unusual, unexpected, dramatic developments in her story, she comes home. Maybe to heal, which is certainly a specifically Native American idea, the idea of returning to one's home, ancestral home, to be healed. But we've also seen this story elsewhere. We have seen people return to the rural place that they left. Again, Ethan Frome did that. Maybe not because he wanted to. Characters in Weinsberg do that. Sula does that. So again, how is Evelina's need to return home, or motivation to return home, similar or different from some of these other characters? And that, at this point, is a question I'm comfortable leaving with you to consider and answer. So eventually, Evelina goes to Geraldine and Judge Couch's wedding. So two characters that have sort of been interested in each other and in love more or less off and on as the novel has progressed when we've encountered them, finally get married. And as a part of this scene, we get a passage that says this: "When we are young, the words are scattered all around us. as they are assembled by experience, so also are we, sentence by sentence, until the story takes shape. This is one of those sort of big thematic, almost philosophical moments. And I would just encourage you to consider, what does it mean? I mean, we're talking about words, we're talking about storytelling here, which is obviously very important both to this book and to Native American culture generally, but also, I would say, important to many of the other books we've read. So the idea that as we age, the words that are sort of just out there randomly start to assemble themselves into a story is a very profound metaphor here. That our own stories are our lives. And when we're young, there is no story, right? My 5-year-old doesn't have much of a story yet. But by the time you get to your age, certainly my age, and especially the age of, say, my parents or grandparents, the story has largely been written. And so the people become the story. And obviously, this is reflected in this novel because it is such a span of time. We go from before Pluto even exists to sort of the final days of Pluto in the last chapters. And so the stories of this town, and by extension the stories of the people that make up a town, because I would argue you can't really have a town without people. You can have buildings without people, but not a town, take shape. So this is one of those moments where, both on the level of character, on the level of plot, and on the level of theme or ideas that the story is interested in, you can sort of draw a straight line through all of it here. The idea that the story is told as we grow. So, interestingly, even though in a more traditionally structured novel we would end with the happy ending of the wedding, here we flash back after the wedding has taken place, after the sort of, maybe expected place for the story to stop, and we flash back to a previous relationship that Judge Coutts had when he was younger with, he refers to her as C, but we later find out she's Dr. Cordelia Lochran. So, first of all, why go back to this after the happy ending? Why flash back? Why end with going back to this earlier relationship? Well, first of all, it's just sort of interesting narratively because we go back and sort of get the rest of the story, right? But it's also important because it slowly hands the baton to Dr. Lochran herself, who, because she lives in the town of Pluto, and this is one of the few parts of the novel that centers primarily on Pluto, the town, she is then able to take the narrative to the present moment at the end, when Pluto is sort of, people are moving away and it's sort of slowly dying, right? So if this were the story primarily of the characters, we might end with the happy ending. But because this is ultimately the story of this place and the people who live there, we do need to come back to somebody that can take us to the end. And one of the other things we focus on, particularly about Pluto in this demolition section, is the Pluto Cemetery. Judge Coutts, before he's Judge Coutts, works there when he's a younger man. And he works with a man who's older than him, who has been taking care of the cemetery. And we get a couple of interesting passages about the Pluto Cemetery. One is this one. He had mapped out the graveyard and knew everything about each person buried there, when they'd come to the town and what they had done, how the family had come to choose that particular stone or monument, cause or moment of death, what property they'd left behind. So there's certainly an idea that the person that Anton works with knows the town through the cemetery. And then there's also this passage that he says about himself. He says, "There was room for me and my wife, even a couple of kids. It seemed far off and laughable then, but as time has passed, I have become increasingly grateful that those places next to my ancestors lie empty and waiting." So if the first passage is largely about the past of Pluto, I would say the second passage is maybe largely about the future. Specifically, it sort of serves as a roadmap to who has been here and who they were. But because a cemetery, at least this cemetery, I would argue most cemeteries, are never quite finished, there's also a sort of open-ended future. We don't know who's going to end up here. We don't know when they're going to end up here. So it serves as a symbol in Pluto for all of these reasons. It serves as sort of a history if you know who's here and what brought them here, and looking at things like the headstones. It serves as a symbol of the future because there's the open area in the future for Judge Coutts. And I think that you could certainly argue that cemeteries serve as symbols for small towns more generally. Again, not that cemeteries aren't symbolic in larger cities, but in a small town, especially a really small town, there is a cemetery, not many cemeteries. And they are often maybe attached to, say, churches, or just outside of town in a larger piece of land. And they serve as sort of, if you are in this town and you are born and live and die here, that is where you end up. So there is a sort of one-to-one ratio that doesn't exist elsewhere when it comes to cemeteries. And certainly you could compare it to cemeteries we've seen in other texts. I think of Ethan Frome's very small family plot that he drives past where his parents are buried, and how that sort of serves symbolically for him. The cemetery in Weinsberg pops up occasionally. So certainly we have this idea of the cemetery as sort of one of the touchstones. If you sort of think of the touchstones in a typical small town or rural place, and I suppose a town more than the sort of open countryside rural, but you have what? You have a courthouse, you have a cemetery, you have a church or churches, maybe you have the post office like in Starkfield. There are certain things that we identify with the small town. And since we started by the last slide by talking about sort of those established things that we continue to identify in small towns. Remember, small towns are very resistant to change in a lot of ways. We get to Ted, Cordelia's husband, and his sort of desire to destroy the old buildings in Pluto in favor of new ones. And certainly this is very interesting thematically and symbolically for a few reasons. One is because there is the idea of renewal in a small town, and maybe knocking down an old dilapidated building and building a new one maybe serves as an opportunity for new, economic or personal possibilities. But we also, because rural communities are so resistant to change, you can't help but sort of also view it as a destructive force, especially the way it's described in the book, where we've got this lovely old Victorian house and it's destroyed to put up sort of cheap square house boxes, right? And here, I think the effect on Pluto is that it's sort of erasing Pluto, the historical Pluto. And so I don't think the text really wants us to view it as a positive, although in the larger idea of the rural that we've talked about, I think it can be. But here, the idea is something is being lost more than something is being gained. We also, as the house is being destroyed, get another animal. And of course, if you've learned anything in this book, it's when you see animals, think about them symbolically. Here it is, the bees. So it's definitely worth asking, how do we read the bees symbolically? If you think about it, Ted punches through this wall to tear down this house, and the bees, which literally live in the walls of the house, come out and attack him. They're almost like the blood or the life force of the house. And they come out and sort of defend themselves and defend the house. So this is one of those moments where we can read this as sort of a negative thing, because if the house fights back when it is being torn down, we tend to sympathize with the house. So that's another way to read an animal symbolically in this book. And we actually end the book with a new point of view, that of Dr. Cordelia Lochran. So what do we know about her? We know she doesn't treat Indians, which seems very, sort of racist, if not at the very least culturally insensitive. And I think at first we really view her sort of negatively for this, even though she seems like a decent enough person in the present. But we also realize, maybe a little late, that it turns out Dr. Cordelia Lochran was the baby in the crib way back when Moosham and Holy Track and Asignac came upon the murder scene at that farmhouse many, many, many years ago. She is the one who lived. We also, by the way, find out that Marnwold's crazy uncle Warren who we met in Marn and Billy Peace's chapter, and then again in the um, mental institution with Evelina, is the person who did the murdering. We finally find that out. The sort of, I suppose, murder mystery of the book from the very beginning finally gets solved here, although by this point it's certainly a book about much more than that mystery. And because the lynching created the idea that Indians killed her family, that is why she doesn't treat Indians. That doesn't maybe excuse that decision, but there's a certain irony or poignancy in realizing that her reason, as reasons go, is maybe perhaps more understandable than most. So, in a weird way, Cordelia Lochran is the character that ties everything together at the end. For a book that seems very sort of all over the map, we've got Musham, we've got Evelina, we've got Geraldine and Anton Basil Couts. We have the flashback to the Lafayette and Henri Peace brothers and the trip out to discover the land. And we've got Evelina's college, and we've got all these things all over the place. Suddenly, it's all tied together by the end. Even the sort of somewhat separate character of Marn Wold and Billy Peace. So, plot-wise, this sort of snaps everything into focus. Theme-wise, it reminds us one last time that the interwoven nature of a small town is very dense. And this is a book that, on one hand, lets us see the individual threads, but on the other hand, also points out that past a certain point, there are too many to make sense of. And of course, we also have the symbol of the stamps. And we can also view those as symbols. And I'll let you sort of consider the symbolism there. But, you know, they were Evelina's father's sort of retirement plan, but then we get new information about them in this chapter. So you can definitely also ask yourself the question, what do the stamps symbolize? And finally, I love it when a book gives you a passage that lets you sort of wrap up your consideration of it. And here I would say not only does this passage do it for The Plague of Doves, but I think it, to some extent, also does it for many of the books we've read in this class. So Dr. Lochran tells us at the end, talking about the town of Pluto. She says, "Our highway had never been improved, so we began to steadily diminish. And as we did, I became the repository of many untold stories, such as people will finally tell when they know there is no use in keeping secrets, or when they see that all that's left of a place will one day reside in documents, and they want those to reflect the truth." So what is the thematic meaning here? Well, we've talked many times about how small towns are more interested in appearance than truth. Right? And that's true. We see that in Weinsberg. We see that with people's interior truths. We see Ethan wants Maddie, but it's more important to not rock the cultural boat of Starkfield. But there comes a point, and it's arrived for Pluto, where the town is dying, where most of these people are dead up in that cemetery we were talking about. And nobody cares anymore about the old grudges or the old secrets. And there's a shift from wanting to put on the best appearance to wanting some version of the truth to move forward. That at some point we want people to know what this place really was. We want it to not actually be permanently forgotten. And at that moment, the idea of maintaining the truth of a place becomes important. I think to some extent we get that also in Maxwell's sort of reflection on his hometown in Illinois. And so it is applicable to other texts. But this is sort of a nice place to end, not just for The Plague of Doves, although it's a great place to end for that, but also for this class, because we have moved from sort of the early idea of the small town when it was full of sort of hope and vigor. You think of all the way back to Rip Van Winkle, you know, these new towns in the colonies where things were happening, and with sort of Ethan Frome and Weinsberg, when this was sort of the typical American life on these towns, and we move forward through, you know, Sula, and we move forward through In Country, where these places are changing. Technology changes it, moves to urban centers change it, and finally we end up in Pluto, where the sort of, I suppose, life cycle of the American small town is sort of reaching its zenith. I would argue that that's not true of all small towns, but certainly as we've studied these books in this course, it seems like a fitting place to sort of stop. That the small town here, in this case, has sort of reached, if not its final moment, then it is aware of its final moment. And I don't think that it's an accident that this moment is being talked about, is being narrated by an elderly woman who herself has sort of reached that point in her life. So again, we get that sort of symbolic thematic resonance. So I will let you do with that what you will in your thinking and maybe on your final exam. Thank you for making it to the end of the final presentation. Again, the class ends this week, so do your quiz, do your posts, and then next week there's a module on the course site that says final exam week. At some point during final exam week, I would argue the sooner the better for a variety of reasons. You don't want it to sneak up on you and run out of time. You need to complete your exam. Once you've done that, you are done. Your grades will be posted. You'll get your grade, and hopefully you will do well. So thank you not only for listening to the presentation this week, but for listening to many, many presentations. I don't assume that sitting and listening to me talk for sometimes over an hour is something that is easy to do, but I appreciate that you have done it. I wish you all well, and get in touch if you have any questions.